I think we grossly miscalculated. Putin had made several speeches over the last 20 years, repeatedly saying, please do not advance the border to Russia. Do not try to transform Ukraine into a hostile actor, an actor with hostile intentions towards Russia. What happens in Ukraine is of existential strategic interest to us, just as theoretically, what happens in Mexico is of existential strategic interest to us, although this administration has decided to ignore it. That's going to come back to haunt us, and if you're looking for future conflict, that's where to look for it, not in Europe and not in Asia. But the point is that Putin wasn't pulling any wool over anyone's eyes, and Putin absolutely didn't want a war. If you go back and look at the force that he sends into Ukraine earlier in February of 2022, he goes in with about 90,000 troops. He limits his advances to the periphery because he expected that we would negotiate, that he would demonstrate that this was serious and that Russia wanted its population in eastern Ukraine, which is really Russian, to have equal rights before the law. He wanted to end the oppression of the Russians that lived there. And he wasn't going to surrender Crimea. The reason he went into Crimea is he was afraid it was going to be turned into a U.S. naval base by the Ukrainians at the earliest opportunity. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. Now, he went along and thought that he might get a negotiated settlement, and he finally figured out after several months, nobody's going to talk to me, especially after Biden said, our goal is regime change. Our goal is to get rid of Putin. And our goal is ultimately to divide Russia into constituent parts, then exploit it. All of his supporters, his staffers, everyone in the globalist camp knows this is the truth. The so-called oligarchs, Kolomoisky, Soros, and others are all part of this. None of this is news. Finally, he said, enough's enough. He stopped. They set up a strategic defense. They ran an economy of force mission, and now they have a force in place that can go as far as it needs to go, which includes to the Polish border. They have a plan for a 31-month war against us if we insist on fighting it. And we are in no shape to fight a war. We can't even recruit for the United States Army or the Marines. The Marines are running around trying to recruit illegals and are being encouraged to do so by the administration. Is that what you want in the ground force to fight for this country? Forget it. It's not going to work.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess that's interesting. I mean, a lot of people probably aren't aware of that because I think when you look at it sort of on paper, you know, you obviously have the media reports, right? Every time, you know, Russia takes a big town, well, it's not really of strategic importance, but every time Ukraine claws back 7 inches in a major military victory. So, you know, you see the gamesmanship happening in the media, but I'll say this as an outsider who doesn't know and perhaps, you know, didn't know that, hey, maybe that was maybe him coming in was to bring everyone to the table in a negotiating tactic. But, you know, you think of it like me with sort of, again, that Cold War mentality of like, you know, the Russian army will steamroll. It's like, well, how did they not take over this country in 2 weeks, let alone, you know, a year and a half now? To me, and maybe to the uneducated on the subject, it feels like maybe one of the bigger sort of miscalculations or underperformances of recent military history. Is that not the case, or is that also a combination of it? Did he, you know, misjudge some of it, or is that just because, you know, 130 billion in missiles given to a militia, you know, can still hold back someone who's not going all out, or, you know, using tactical nukes or whatever it may be, that next escalation where he could, you know, again, take over the country rather quickly?
Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is an Orthodox Christian country that is rooted in Russian nationality, history, culture, language, and ethnicity. So forget the Soviet Union. Ukraine is a brother Slavic country. The last thing Putin wanted to do was destroy Ukraine. Putin would have been perfectly happy to have Crimea recognized, to gain those equal rights for Russians inside eastern Ukraine, and to declare the place neutral. Because the neutral Ukraine would have provided exactly what you're discussing. Not only a buffer for NATO and the West, a buffer for him, for Russia. He wasn't interested in any of the things that he's been accused of. That's what Professor Mearsheimer has said. Anyone who understands Russia, knows what's happened over there since 1992, gets it. All of that's over now. You're your dad, President Trump, could have intervened in February or March and put an end to this quickly. And I'm confident that he would have. We would have convened talks without preconditions. We'd have come to some sort of new territorial arrangement. And I think we would have had a neutral Ukraine, which was in everyone's interest, and no war. But now those days are past. This government in Moscow, it's not just President Putin, his entire population is enraged. They don't trust anyone in the West, especially since Chancellor Merkel and now President Macron have both admitted that the so-called Minsk Accords, which are supposed to address these issues, were a facade. They were a fraud. They were designed to, quote unquote, buy time to build up Ukraine. And they built it up. That was not a militia that was defending eastern Ukraine. They were actually very good soldiers. Most are now dead. They've had 300 to 350,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers, another 300,000 or 400,000 wounded. They're now forcibly dragging old men and boys into uniform to fight. They're desperate, which is why they'll take anything they can get. The Russians are not desperate. They don't have a recruiting problem. They've had 100,000 volunteers in addition to the 300,000 reservists or more that they've mobilized. Russia's population is squarely behind Putin. What have we got here in this country? We have a divided society, divided along every conceivable issue, from economics, class, race, you name it. And this society doesn't even support the military establishment that desperately needs talent and Americans inside uniform. And this is what this administration thinks it can commit to a war? I mean, this is sheer lunacy. We need to get out of this before we're dragged into something. And the notion that we could take on the Chinese, a nation of 1.4 billion people, what do you plan to do with your military power against that? What makes you think anything we would do would influence them? And as President Trump pointed out, that's an economic competition, one that he could handle. Unfortunately, we're not even in the competition anymore. We've surrendered.
Well, the Navy has a drag queen influencer that's going to help the recruitment problem right now, Colonel, so I'm sure things will be just fine. What could go wrong?
That's true. Well,
maybe Xi will laugh himself to death because I have a feeling that's probably not going to have the intended effect, or maybe it will have the intended effect, and that's just where the military is right now. But maybe talk about your military background. How did it shape your views on foreign policy? Because I know as we talk about the wars, I think your views on war and perhaps America's involvement in war have also changed, right? From some of the early sort of Middle Eastern stuff where you were at the beginning of that to where you are now is probably grossly changed. So how did that evolve?
Well, remember, I and most of the people of my generation, our formative experience was service in NATO in Europe. And when NATO went away, most of us stood around in 1992, 93, 94 and said, well, NATO has to go in one of two directions. Either it becomes Europeanized, in other words, the Europeans take responsibility for themselves, we can still be a partner, or we just leave because there's no mission for us in Europe anymore. By the way, I had plenty of experience with Russian organizations and units after the fall of the wall, and I can tell you they were absolutely not our enemies. In fact, they did great work for us, particularly before we went into Afghanistan. But if I go back to the 1970s and I look at the ruins in which the military was found at that point, and then look through the 1980s where we rebuilt and we improved our position dramatically, it took very little time after 1991 for that military to be dismantled and ultimately to be ruined. And we got more and more generals and more headquarters and fewer soldiers. We lost 163,000 experienced combat soldiers in 1991 and 1992. And we kept every general officer we had on active duty and added some. This is the problem. This rot has been underway for a long time. And we've lost the discipline, the cohesion, the esprit de corps. I would say Special Operations Forces was an area where there was a holdout. And of course, the administration hates special operations because they claim it's another hotbed of white supremacy. So they're now talking about trying to do
Well, listen,
away with as much of it as they
everything
can.
is white supremacy or climate change, just so we're clear. I mean, at least in the minds of the left, any problem can either stem from white supremacy or climate change or both. So, yes.
So my argument is in 1991, we were a very healthy organization, but we were also disappointed, many of us, because we thought that we had gone over there to fight a war and win it. We discovered after a very short period of time, hostilities were ended. And then the big lie was perpetrated that, well, we really didn't set out to remove Saddam Hussein. That's not really why we went. We just wanted them out of Kuwait, which is not true, because we then began trying at every opportunity to kill Saddam Hussein wherever he went. We bombed the place into the Stone Age. So the bottom line is we stood around and said, well, wait a minute, we could go to Baghdad with 5,000 men and pick up Saddam Hussein and that bunch and put another group of Iraqi generals in charge and let the UN handle it. The last thing we needed to do was occupy anything. And of course, when we went back in 2003, originally that was the plan. We were not going to occupy. But again, the same people that pushed nation building in Somalia, nation building in the Balkans, suddenly we were going to build a nation in Iraq. And the insanity took off from there. If we had picked up Saddam Hussein and simply said, thanks very much, we're out of here, you and I and a lot of other people wouldn't even talk about the place today. But we stayed and tried to govern it with our military. What a catastrophe. The last thing you want to do is occupy anything. Now we're trying to fight a proxy war for all the wrong reasons, and we're killing the Ukrainian nation. They're down to perhaps 14 to 18 million now from an original population back in January of 2022 of about 34 million. Everyone's left that could go. They've either gone east, almost 2 million into Russia, or 10 million west into Europe. And when you talk to them on the way out, as most of the news media have, they say, well, you go back. Never. Yeah. Ukraine is the historic breadbasket of Europe. It is enormously productive. It could be the gleaming jewel economically if we had neutralized it. It could be as wealthy and prosperous today as Austria is. And that was the model. That's what we should have done. Instead, we got this terrible war. And today, Russia is not weak. Russia's military is now larger and stronger than anything that we've seen since the 1980s. Its economy is booming. And as I said earlier, 81 nations are headed to St. Petersburg in June for a major conference, the purpose of which is to bring them into this larger plan to back currency with gold. And the gold in China, the gold in Russia, the gold in India is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. It's just the beginning. The question is, what do we do? And these people in Washington have no answers. No. And that's why prices rise, services fall apart, the armed forces are in ruins, our borders are open, and there is no rule of law. We are being destroyed by this regime in Washington. Well, actually, when you're walking around on the ground with a weapon, everything can kill you. You have no protection at all. So you're better off in an armored fighting vehicle in 90% of the cases. The problem is that if you go out there without effective air and missile defense, you're done.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to counter the enemy's air and missiles. We have lots of systems, but our army has neglected this for decades. Simply because since World War II and even during the Second World War, we didn't need much air defense. Remember that when we fought the Germans in Western Europe, their air force was largely stripped away or defending cities against bombing attacks. So we were usually dealing with, 1 or 2 airplanes, and we had 5,000 over us protecting us. Well, that's all changed now. But there are lots of systems that can annihilate these small drones. You can shoot down cruise missiles. What you cannot shoot down are hypersonic missiles. But hypersonic missiles are not meant for troops in the field. They're meant for headquarters, command and control, bunkers, ships at sea, large capital ships, aircraft carriers, this sort of thing. But we have to rethink how we organize. And it's a question of, do you need tanks? Of course you do. How many do you need versus other things? And what kind of air and missile defense do you have with you? The Ukrainians are in a lot of trouble right now because the Russians have spent months annihilating all of the air defenses that they have. Because the Russians learned from the Second World War, once the air defense is gone, you can operate as you wish and annihilate everything. And that's where the Russians are headed now. Ukrainians have almost no air defense left. And we, by the way, have almost nothing we can afford to ship them unless we're willing to operate without any air defense ourselves. We don't have the war stocks anymore. We've given it all up. All the artillery, ammunition, missiles, and so forth. It'll take years to replenish the arsenals in the United States and elsewhere across Europe. Again, another reason why it makes a lot of sense not to go to war. We just don't have the ammunition, the missiles, the rockets. We don't even have the right structure and organization for it. So back to your first point, you got to get rid of those 44 4-stars. Then you need a new structure where you take it down to about 10 4-stars and you simplify your structure. We've got too many headquarters with too many focuses and too many interests. And in the meantime, you take 30 or 40,000 U.S. combat troops and you put them on the Mexican border immediately and stop it. Well, remember that all of your intercontinental ballistic missiles that fly at a rate of 30, 40,000 feet per second, they are all hypersonic. So we have hypersonic missiles. They're intercontinental ballistic missiles. The hypersonic missiles we're focused on at the moment are designed for shorter ranges on a regional basis to be largely conventional. Can they be nuclear? Of course. But the nuclear option is not the first option for the Russians and the Chinese. Both have made that very clear. China embraced a no first use doctrine decades ago. Now, as far as their arsenal is concerned, you're right. Over the last 10 years, it's been rather modest. They've only maintained what they thought they needed, which was, by our standards, maybe a few hundred warheads to protect themselves against a nuclear attack. They're now doubling that overnight. They're building far more missiles. But the Chinese have been far more afraid of us and afraid of our attacks than anything else. And there's no interest in China in conquering Taiwan. The timeline for reunification, according to Xi, who is the current emperor of China, we need to stop thinking about communism and now start thinking about the Chinese as an imperial state as it once was for thousands of years, because that's what it is. Xi has said 2044, 2045, 2046 was the target date. And the thing that we don't understand in this country is that Taiwan and China are very similar in the sense that both peoples in both places want the same thing. They all want to live in a society that looks a lot like Singapore. None of them are interested in liberal democracy. They're all interested in prosperity, making money, having the freedom to make money, having the freedom on a personal level to live as they have lived for hundreds and thousands of years. They're not interested in a society like ours. In fact, the Chinese look at our society and can't even begin to imagine how we live in it. Because if you think the kind of criminality we tolerate would be tolerated in those countries, you're very much mistaken. I'll give you a quick example. The Chinese military is really largely defensive in its orientation. There are no Chinese armies massing to prepare to march into Southeast Asia. In fact, they met with the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese and the Chinese have reassured each other there will be no war between them. And we have been trying to goad the Vietnamese into a relationship with us, thinking that somehow or another we can leverage them against the Chinese. You have a similar phenomenon on the Korean Peninsula. The South Koreans aren't interested in going to war with China. China is their biggest trading partner. And then there's Japan, very similar. The Japanese now have with China something they have not had ever in their history. They have what we would call a free trade arrangement. They have access to Chinese markets. One of the reasons the Japanese and the Chinese fought with each other is that the Chinese emperors always insisted that you pay tribute to China. It was kind of a tax that allowed you access to the market, but you had to pay tribute. Japanese don't pay tribute to anybody. And so the Japanese went to war. Well, that's over. The Japanese have factories in China. The Japanese can send their agricultural products to China. They may have disputes, but no one is going to go to war with them. No one in Asia is talking about a war except us.
So you
and if you think you can fight a war with China with the United States Navy, you're insane. All those surface ships, if they come within 200 nautical miles of China, they'll be targeted and sunk. There's no future for that. We don't need to do it. Everything has changed. Submarines. unmanned submersibles, space-based intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance platforms. Those are the things that dominate warfare. Large surface fleets are a thing of the past, which I think is part of the reason the Navy is so anxious to paint China as this great enemy on the scale of Imperial Japan. But we're not going to fight that way in the future. And China is not interested in a war with us.
So
now,
you wrote
does
a
that
book
mean
a few years
Chinese
ago.
are friends of ours? Of course not. I mean, we're the ones with the open borders. Why is the fentanyl coming into the United States? Because our borders are open. Why are the Chinese stealing from us our IP? Because we let them in. I go to business in Northeast Asia. The Koreans and Japanese look at me and say, what are you, stupid? You see any Chinese in our universities, our laboratories? This is nothing new. The Chinese have been stealing everything for centuries. That's why they end up being thrown out of everybody's country across Asia every so many years. I mean, the point is, protect the United States. That's number one. And much of the difficulty we have with China will go away.